Thank you everyone for joining us today. We are here in the Social Identity and Morality Lab at New York University, and I'm excited to have three speakers in the lab who are going to talk about their journey to a postdoc, not only in our lab, but at other universities. And in many countries where they've pursued these opportunities, we're going to talk about kind of the steps that you can take and the different journeys that there are to landing a postdoc. And it turns out there's not a one-size-fits-all approach. There's different approaches for different people. And so I've encouraged them to share their perspective. They're going to share some slides. And then at the very end, we're going to have a question and answer period. So thank you for joining us. And I'll turn it over. I think, Diego, did we decide you were going to go first?
Yeah,
okay.
I'll kick it off.
Okay.
Let me share my screen with you guys. All right, thanks for bearing with me there. Can everyone see my slides? Jay, can you see my slides?
Yep, looks good.
Great. All right, so yeah, this is sort of informal. Just wanted to share my own perspective on and kind of tips and advice on landing a postdoc. As Jay mentioned, there's a lot of different ways to do it. So I thought I would just kind of give a little bit of general advice about how you go about thinking about a postdoc and some things to consider, and a little snapshot of kind of my own process, and happy to talk and take questions at the end as well. So as Jay mentioned, there is no silver bullet to all of this. But one thing that I think is important is that even though there's no silver bullet, I do think it helps a bit if you can aim. So I think keeping some stuff in mind, doing a little bit of planning in advance, I think if that is possible, I think that kind of helps you navigate figuring out the process of going from being a grad student to a postdoc and finding a good situation that can help move your career forward. So the first thing that I just wanted to kind of bring up was that there's this general, I view it sort of as like a general two split between actually reaching out and contacting a professor that you might be interested in postdocing with, versus just sort of simply looking and browsing on job boards and applying to sort of open calls. In other words, places where people have posted openings for postdocs and they're looking and recruiting for someone, and you can just sort of openly apply to that. And I think those two, I'm viewing those as sort of two different categories because I think they have different situational features about them, and you approach those sort of in different ways. Obviously, the open calls is a little more cut and dry. You can just find things that look interesting to you, note what you need to do to send in your materials, and you just send it in, right? And so it's just sort of like just sending off applications to things. I think in the postdoc market in psychology, but maybe also more broadly in STEM or academia, there's, as anything, social relationships matter, and you can do work by, getting in contact with people early and finding and talking to them directly if they have openings or funding for you. So I think that those are two different things. I'll focus probably a little bit more on the email inquiry side, because again, I think the open calls are just more cut and dry, that you're just sort of finding postings that are up online and just sending out a bunch of job apps. So of course, I think one thing that you can do is reach out directly to people that you might be interested in postdocing with. I sent a few emails out, and you would include sort of like a brief abstract of kind of your body of work. You might attach your CV, maybe a paper that you recently published, and just sort of ask if they have any openings or for postdocs, or if they're looking for that. You can also set up a time maybe during non-COVID times to actually maybe get coffee with them if they're nearby, or if you have a conference coming up that you're both going to be at, to just maybe talk about some ideas. Maybe say that you really admire their work. You'd love to like chat more about some ideas because some of your stuff relates. And I think that's important, just to get a little bit of face-to-face time with them. Then they kind of know who you are. If you have that in-person coffee with them, and then you follow up the email later, they're going to recognize who you were. And so I think that those kind of connections can be useful as well. it's also great. You can, if you have a chance to present in their lab meeting or something, that also kind of builds a little bit of, it facilitates, the social connection and lets them know a little bit more about your work. So they have a better sense of who you are and what skills and ideas you bring. Also, it's great if you can have your advisor connect you. So obviously Jay knows a lot of folks, and if he happens to know the person you're interested in working with, he might actually just be able to send like an intro email to kind of start that conversation off. So just a number of different ways to kind of go about that first point of contact when you're just trying to get on someone's radar and maybe just see if they're interested. And don't be shy, even if they don't have funding. If they like you, they're going to be willing to probably try and find funding with you. So don't worry right off. Don't exclude someone just because you're not sure if they have funding. So one thing that's obviously where you would start would be identifying a good possible postdoc advisor. So it's not dissimilar from identifying a good grad school advisor, but it's not exactly the same. But a lot of the sort of similar principles apply. You would want to think of someone in the literature who you'd really admire or would love to collaborate with. But importantly, you do want to think about, what are you going to get out of this postdoc? Sort of what's the goal from it? How are you hoping that you're going to learn and grow as a researcher? Is it that this person in their lab, they have a new theory or new methods or new skill set? That maybe all of those things or one of those things you would be building out? Is it sort of just simply an extension of your work, which could also be okay, that's not like some earth-shattering paradigm that they do differently, but maybe they just do stuff that's really, really in line with what you do already. But I think you just want to be conscious and think about, what am I getting out of this? What does this lab or person have that I might be able to build from? Obviously helpful to talk to your advisors. They know a lot of people in the field, or they might get a sense of who might be good people to talk to try and figure out, okay, who are potential positive postdoc advisors. Once you get to the stage of actually identifying some people, right, talking to the people in that prospective advisor's lab, whether they're current students, postdocs, or former students or postdocs, is really helpful, right? Sort of just to get a sense of how they treat and mentor and fund and place their postdocs. So you get hopefully you could get a little bit of a sneak peek on the inside of, what's life like in this lab. And particularly, what is it like to be a postdoc in that lab? You might only be there for 1, 2, 3 years. And you might, want to figure out kind of how that works, what kind of style they have with working with those postdocs. So talking to folks in that lab can be helpful. And eventually, right, you'll want to start maybe creating a list of possible advisors, and you can start rank ordering. That's something that I did. Another really important feature, other than of course just identifying who you want to work with and kind of maybe creating a list and starting to think through it, is funding and what it might mean. So this might not be exhaustive, but I think probably the two primary ways of thinking about this is that either the professor has a grant and you can join that grant, and that's how they'll fund your postdoc and your salary. And that will probably mean that you will be working on that grant or projects related to it. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. And that might be great because maybe the grant is exactly what you wanted to do. Or it might be limiting because maybe you want to work with this PI, but not really on that grant, but it's kind of the only way that you can get funded. And so now you're joining this group and you're going to have to work on this project that you're not so psyched about and hopefully find time to do other stuff. So it's just something to kind of be thinking about. Of course, the other way is to have your own funding. You can apply to university fellowships, teaching postdocs, foundation grants, federal grants, right? And so you can apply with that potential postdoc advisor for some of these things to kind of together, but that's sort of you bringing your own money to their lab, right? It's not like they have an existing grant that they're just funding off of. And that, of course, those things give you a lot more flexibility with the kind of research you can do. But of course, the flip side is maybe it's a little less stable, right? Maybe the fellowship is only for a year, or maybe it's just 2 years. Whereas maybe if a PI has a multi-year, grant, they could fund you for unlimited time. I know some folks who feel like they have as many years as they need to do their postdoc because they just feel really stably funded by some grants or multiple grants that the PI has. So I think for postdocs, funding is probably one of the biggest things that you're thinking about, is like, how am I going to fund myself? Or how am I getting funded, and what does that mean for the work that I'll do in the lab? I mean, it's a pretty important thing to think about. Speaking of funding, because it is so important, I thought it'd be useful just to get a quick snapshot of some of the just kind of rough data on postdoc salaries in the US. So there's actually not a lot of information out there. at least from a kind of cursory look that I did, which doesn't surprise me. I think it's hard to identify all this, but there was a paper a couple years ago that did take a look at postdoc salary data in the US, and they were able to get data from almost like 52 universities. Almost all of them were public. That's how they were able to even access the data. So it's about 13,000, almost 14,000 postdocs. So it's pretty good. It's like 30% of the estimated postdoc workforce in the US. So just a snapshot here, you can see they split it out by different regions in the US. So like, Midwest, Northeast, but the leftmost pairing of box plots there is kind of grouped all together. And you can see this is kind of the range of salaries. So you can see most of the time, the median salary is probably, what is that, like maybe close to 50,000, maybe not quite, but in and around that range, around 50,000. And then you have these outliers, right, that are people who are somehow making, I don't know, $23,000 to $38,000. So that's more like grad student pay. I don't know, that's a bummer I don't know how that situation is working out. But, and then you have people who are getting really like pretty comfy salaries in the 60s, even extending up into the 70s and 80s. And then apparently some people, some real outliers are like pushing six figures, but I wouldn't expect that. That's clearly, that might be like a B school postdoc who just got like a super sweet deal or something. But yeah, so just to give you a sense, this is kind of maybe roughly what you might expect. Here's another graph that's similar, that just splits it out by the kind of postdoc they called. Postdocs can be called all sorts of things like trainees and fellows and postdoc associates and research, scientists and researchers. So it's all these different labels are all kind of a similar role, but yeah, I think this graph on the left is probably most informative. But also I think we can look at just a couple of examples that are maybe closer to home or more concrete. So for example, the NSF has a postdoc, the Social Behavioral Economic Postdoc Research Fellowship something. So the NSF has one that you can apply for. They pay, this is just their salary funding. So it comes with like 54K in salary. I think it also comes with like a research fund of maybe like 15,000 a year. So again, this is pretty median, right, with what you were seeing on that last graph, kind of in that 50,000 range, 54,000. The NIH has one that's also the same. These are federal grants that you can get, right? NIH, NRSA is also like 54,000 a year in salary. And the research funds for that, I think, is like 11,000 a year. So again, these are just salary numbers. But then you can compare these to maybe some other like kind of university specific programs or fellowships. So UPenn has this program called MindCore. It's like a kind of broad group of behavioral scientists. Their salary there is like 57, so a little bit higher. They also have about 20K in research support. So that's a pretty comfy research support funding package there. And you can compare that to like Princeton's public policy postdoc. I know a lot of us have talked about that over the years, but a bunch of folks from our program have gone through and done that. That salary is maybe a little closer to 60K a year. So again, you're getting a little bit better, but also I think their compensation, their research funds are maybe notably lower. Maybe it's more like 2K. So things to kind of just keep in mind as you're going through, and also just hopefully this is giving you kind of just a baseline of what's out there. Once you get to the B school world, things like Northwestern Kellogg or Columbia B School, right, you start to see the numbers jump up 70, 80K just in salary. So, and maybe you get bonuses if you're, teaching a class at a B school or something. But anyway, these are just like a few concrete examples of kind of what those numbers look like at some places. Again, that's just sort of just a few places, so not like a random sample or anything, but hopefully this gives you a sense. Okay, so quickly, what materials will you need? Again, depends on how you're getting your money. If your PI already has a grant, I don't know if you'll need much. They might just say, great, come join the lab. Love to have you on board, and that's it. It might be as simple as that. If you're, contacting them directly. If you're applying to like a university fellowship or foundation grant, those kinds of things, usually it's CV, research statement, maybe a writing sample, like a paper you've written or published, some letters of rec, and maybe a one-page proposed budget. So it's sort of standard. It's nothing too onerous, but of course, if you apply to a lot of places, it can grow. And then of course, it can get a little bit more involved if you're applying to federal grants like NSF or NIH, right? You have project summaries and facilities and equipment things and supplemental documents about your mentoring and data management plan. So they're just a lot more involved. And it's interesting because those actually, you'll notice on that last graph, right, the federal NSF and NIH compared to some university, again, the ones I was showing you is sort of a select group of universities, but compared to some universities, actually your pay might be less. The flip side is that I think the applying to federal grants is actually a really good experience for if you want to become a professor at a PI at a research university, because you have to show evidence of being able to bring in money and win grants. And so gaining experience with applying to federal grants is actually pretty good. And if you win some of those, I think it shows nice evidence that you can do that. So I think it kind of buys you more on the CV than maybe a university fellowship would do, which is a different kind of application. So just an idea of like what materials you might be thinking about. When to start, again, this assumes sort of a 5-year PhD timeline. And again, this is not, the straight arrow is deceiving because not all things are so linear like this for in life and for different people. So, but just as an idea, let's say you're on a 5-year track to finish your PhD. Sometime in your 4th year might be a good time to start thinking about it, who you maybe want to work with, right? So like in your spring of your 4th year, you've got conferences like SPSP and SANS coming up. So chances to maybe meet with people or organize a symposium with someone. You also have kind of a first deadline of some things like the NIH, NRSA. I think they have multiple deadlines throughout the year. The John Templeton Foundation and the Russell Sage Foundation, they might have deadlines kind of recurring around then. Things that you'd have to check their websites and look for the times for each year, but that might come up then. Then I think later in the summer, NIH has yet another deadline that you could submit for NRSA. And then your 5th year fall, like so sort of your last year, a lot of stuff's due that fall, right? So like kind of in the November, December time period, you're going to start seeing a lot of deadlines for NSF, maybe some other foundation grants, and university fellowships, I think are often due kind of around that late winter, early, January, February timeline. You might see certain PIs put out calls for on listservs or on Twitter or wherever saying that they're hiring, they're looking for a postdoc. So you might see that around that time. And that all just kind of continues into the spring of kind of your last year, right? And again, the conferences are coming around. There might be more calls from PIs, more university fellowship deadlines might be due. So that's kind of like an arc of when things are coming up and deadlines are due. And so starting early is actually super helpful if you can, because again, funding is important and you might need time to apply to funding. And you might need time to apply to multiple things. Maybe you applied to a John Templeton grant in the spring, it didn't come through. So then at least now you have a chance to apply to an NSF later in the fall, right? So just sort of maybe building in some catches for when things don't work out, which happens all the time in academia. But again, I just also want to emphasize it's okay if you aren't on the timeline. So if you're a 5th year seeing this and you're like, oh no, I haven't started yet, like don't worry and freak out. It'll be fine. Again, everyone has their own timeline and finds ways to make things work. So this is just sort of like, if you had the time and the foresight into it, this might be a good thing to keep in mind. Also, if you're trying to set up talks in other people's labs, right? If you identify somebody in your 4th year, maybe during your 4th year or early in your 5th year, you can give a talk in their lab and that can kind of get the ball rolling. So that kind of thing for timeline. So just a really quick snapshot of my journey. Just as a way of sort of mentioning that I had obviously I'm going to be at Princeton with Aline Coman, and I wanted to highlight just a little bit of kind of how that relationship formed, but also then just sort of briefly like how things unfolded. So actually as a 2nd year, I met him at Brown Bag at NYU. I think he came to give a talk. I think I introduced him actually, and then I went to like a student lunch with him. So I remember we had a chance to have a conversation and meet. This is also a plug for NYU students to take advantage of opportunities when speakers come to meet with them, talk with them. If you think that their research is interesting, just because it might be a nice conversation to have. And also, who knows, maybe you'll end up actually having a good relationship with them and they might become a collaborator or they might even become a potential postdoc advisor. So and actually later that year, as the 2nd year, he ended up inviting me he was organizing a mini conference at Princeton. So he invited me to speak at that. So I had this kind of early relationship with him a little bit as a 2nd year. And then a couple years later, as a 4th year, some grad students invited me again to Princeton to speak as part of their emerging scholar series. And that gave me, again, actually one of the students from his lab was part of this organizing group. And again, that gave me more face time with some of his students. And I saw him while I was there. So there was a little bit of just sort of being on someone's radar and sort of seeing them. But in terms of my actual timeline, I just talked about how you should try and start early if you can. I started early, but I wasn't also starting in my like penultimate year. Right? I actually was starting more kind of in my last year. So just goes to show you that again, it's okay if you're not on this like tracked linear. Like everyone has a different path and timeline to things. But yeah, summer of my going into my last year, I started to make a list of sort of like a top 10 advisors and whittled it down to a top 5. I started talking to PhD students and postdocs in those labs when it was possible to get a sense of how they are and how it might be to be a postdoc with them and try and kind of work my list down a little bit. And then in the fall of my last year, I started emailing, I talked to Jay throughout all of this and I started emailing some potential advisors to see if they were taking postdocs. And I got a green light from Aline saying he was interested in having me on board. And then through the next kind of period in the fall and into the winter, as I was showing you earlier, a lot of apps were due. So I was applying to a number of different funding opportunities to try and fund my postdoc with him. And also just other open calls that came up that looked really interesting. So I applied to 6, and then I think I had plans to apply to 6 more, but then I ended up getting offers early enough that I didn't need to continue applying. So just a really quick snapshot. Again, I'm happy to go into like more nitty gritty detail during some Q&A if you guys have questions about stuff. I also picked the brains of some people around me and started trying to synthesize some kind of top recommendations. So again, if you can start early, maybe the penultimate year before you graduate. But importantly, again, just think about what are you hoping to achieve from your postdoc, and the more clarity you have, probably the better. Think about your funding situation. How are you going to be financially supported? What does that mean about your freedom to do your own work versus working on PI's grant? How financially stable will you be? Those are probably some of the most important questions that you need to think about and try and figure out. It's helpful if you can create a relationship with the postdoc PI. However that comes about, there's so many different ways that can be coming about. Just give talks at conferences, in their labs, anything that you can do to sort of get your work out there and let people know who you are and what kind of research you do and what kind of person you are. Also give yourself time to get multiple rounds of feedback on your material. So as you're applying to things, whether it's an NSF, an NIH, or university fellowship, or what have you, as anything, getting feedback from the lab, from cohort mates, that's all really helpful. Don't be shy. It can sometimes be like a little nerve-wracking to show your materials to people and be like, this is what I have. It's maybe okay, I don't know. Right, maybe you're a little self-conscious about it, but the more you can get it out there, the better your stuff will be, because people will just give you good feedback, and they'll help improve your work and your thinking and your writing. Same thing with giving talks. So do that. You can always ask for materials from successful candidates to get a sense of how that grant app looked or how their research statement looked or whatever. And also you can consider other, this is sort of geared towards like psych postdocs, but you can consider B schools or adjacent programs like in communications or social work, because they're often great overlaps with depending on your research, with some of these other places, and they might have really great opportunities and postdoc programs that you could apply to. So don't nix those from your search. Like, you should definitely keep those on your radar, especially if you want to become a professor in one of the departments. And of course, it would make sense to try and postdoc in one of those departments. This was just sort of an overview of things. The internet has so many resources and so much advice. This document by Jacqueline Siegel is not exhaustive, but it's also very comprehensive. So there are links here. The bit.ly link will take you to it, and I'll share my slides with you all. But there are like tons of links to advice on postdocs and funding places and places to look for things. It's just like a nice, really nice aggregated, probably like 15-page Google Doc or something that has a ton of stuff. So that's a good resource to go to. If you're looking for open calls, these are some places that you'd find them. The Psych Job Wiki, on different SPSP, APS, APA job boards, like Chatter on Twitter. Yeah, so just places that you might be able to find things. Of course, just on Twitter in general, people have tons of advice as always, and some of it's pretty good. So people will post, Jessica Flake or Jacqueline Siegel or Caitlin Werner. They had some recent threads where they talk about getting postdocs and their advice for it. So again, you always want to take things with a grain of salt. Everyone's situation is a little different, but when you can read a little bit about what they're saying, you'll start seeing some of the commonalities of the advice that people are giving. And there are bit.ly links here too, so you can always jump to those threads. So yeah, that's kind of all I had. I just wanted to give a quick shout out to these folks who I texted like yesterday and asked if they had any 1 or 2 pieces of advice to see if there was anything I could help throw into this presentation. So a bunch of their comments overlapped and were similar, and were helpful in kind of putting this together and feeding into some of the recommendations. So quick shout out to them. And yeah, I'll wrap up and happy to take questions afterward.
Thank you, Diego. That was super helpful. I will turn to Victoria, who's going to give our next presentation, and then we'll have a panel discussion at the end.
All right, let me share my screen real quick. All right. So I'm going to be talking about networking into a postdoc, mostly because that was basically the only path that I took trying to get a postdoc. And I'm not going to be going into like as much like detail or data as Diego did, but I will instead be focusing just on like my experience and some suggestions about like ways to do this that, sorry, hold on, like my mom's on the phone downstairs, I'm on speaker, so just a second. Okay, sorry about that. All right, so first off, networking is not the same thing as being fake or insincere. I feel like a lot of the time, at least for me, like when I think about the idea of networking, my initial reaction is like, oh, well, I don't want to like be using people, or I don't want to come across like I only see them as a path to a job. But I don't think that those are necessarily the same thing. So my approach to networking is thinking about, you know, making friends and like meeting people who have similar interests to me. And if that does ultimately lead to a collaboration, then that's awesome. And hopefully that's mutually beneficial. And if it leads to a postdoc, hopefully that's also mutually beneficial. But it's definitely not, in my mind, the same thing as being inauthentic. I mean, I suppose it does depend on like you as an individual and the way that you're approaching it. But if you're the kind of person who's nervous about whether or not networking is fake, then I don't think that you're at risk for that being like your true motivation or for it coming across that way. So when do you start making connections? Obviously, the best time to start building your network was when you started graduate school. But if you were like me and you didn't hit that deadline, the second best time to start trying to make connections is obviously right now. So you can start by thinking about the connections and the resources that you already have. So for example, external collaborators that you've been working with, as well as friends of your advisor. Like if you're like me and Diego, and you know your advisors have a lot of connections already, then like maybe it's easier for you to just ask them if they know of anybody who's looking for a postdoc right now. You can also think about advisors of your friends, which was a technique that I definitely used when I was thinking about people that I might like to work with, mostly because a lot of my friends that I made through grad school, like at cons and stuff, were people who were interested in similar research as I was. And that was like one of the things that made us become friends. And so the fact that their advisors did work that I was interested in, you know, made sense as well. But okay, what if you need to build new connections? So at conferences, if you're presenting a poster, you can obviously talk to people who come up to your poster, but maybe more proactively, you can think about going to other people's posters and talking to them about their research, getting to know like what's going on in their lab, and if it's anything that's relevant to the direction that you hope that your career will be going in. You can also go up and talk to people after they give talks at conferences. So usually, unless like the symposium went over time, there's like 5 or 10 minutes afterward where you can just go up to the speaker and ask questions about their talk. You could also just, if there is, you know, not much time, like ask them if they want to grab coffee, like Diego mentioned. BarCon, obviously. So normally if you go to something like SPSB, there's an informal sort of conference at night at bars in the area, like the hotel bar, or sometimes like other external nearby bars. So figuring out like where people are going, where people are going to be hanging out is a great way to like make friends in general throughout grad school. And it can also be somewhere that you meet people that could be good potential advisors. Also, like being a yes person. So for me, like when I would go to conferences, one of my mental rules was that if somebody asked me if I wanted to go out, like after the con, I would say yes, unless I was like actually sick or had an existing other plan. My general rule was to always say yes. And that's just a great way to meet people that you have things in common with and start to build these connections and expand your network. I also had a rule that I was only going to spend time at cons with people that I didn't know, by which I mean like not people from my school. So like instead of going out with my existing friends from Penn State, for example, which was where I got my PhD when I'm at SPSP, I would go hang out with the friends that I'd previously made at cons, who attended other schools, mostly because I feel like I always like I already see my friends from grad school all the time anyway. So like it's not like I'm rejecting or neglecting those friendships so much as it is like trying to sustain and continue to build the friendships that you have with people that you don't get to see except for when you're at these cons. So, but if the idea of meeting people that you don't know makes you feel a little bit like shaggy here, don't worry. You can still, as Diego mentioned, send emails as well. You can have your advisor email people that could be a good fit for a postdoc and ask them if they're looking for a postdoc or have funding. You can also, and I do think this one is like slightly better, email them yourself. Part of why I think that the self-initiated emails are better is because you are hoping to present yourself as a junior colleague to this person. And so like the kind of intrinsic reminder that, you have an advisor, that like you need your advisor to contact them for you. Like, I don't think it would like be a red flag, but I just think that it's like a green flag to do it yourself and to show that you're a go-getter, or that you're like able to take the initiative and like to have the confidence to reach out to somebody on your own. So you could obviously just ask them if they have postdocs available. But if you're earlier in your career and you're just trying to meet people and just see what's out there and just get to know other scholars doing similar research, I mean, you can, if you have an idea that would be a good fit for a collaboration, you can just straight up pitch it to them and see if they're interested in collaborating with you. But alternatively, like maybe they came out with a paper recently and you had questions about it. Most scholars are super thrilled to get emails from people they don't know asking questions about their research. Like if I get an email on a paper that I wrote, saying that they liked it or asking a clarifying question, I love that. It's so flattering. Like there's no downside to sending somebody an email and asking a question about their research. There really isn't. So for example, here is an email that I sent to somebody that I met at a conference, like at BarCon. So it was at one of the parties that happens at SPSP. And we had talked at that party about the possibility of doing a postdoc together. And so the next day after I had gotten back to Penn State, I just shot over an email and reminded them about our conversation, and they'd invited me to come give a talk at that school. And so, just touched base again, and that worked out really well. And we ended up applying for grants together. In terms of cold emails, I did find somebody who had a job that they posted on the job wiki, but the deadline had passed, but it didn't look like the position had been filled. So I did send off a cold email here to somebody that I had never spoken to before, and asked them if the position was still open. As you can see from both of these emails, they're relatively informal. In the second case, I think that if the position had not already expired, like if the deadline hadn't passed, I would have done a much more formal cover letter style email. But because it had, and I was just asking if it was actually still available, this was quite short. But for people that you've met like at a conference like with this one, it's totally okay to, not do the formal cover letter as long as you're being polite and respectful. I think that it's fine to be friendly. That's not gonna ding you. Some other options are like if you attend a summer school like CISP or the Summer in Cognitive Neuroscience. This is actually how I ended up talking to Jay about doing a postdoc, but it's also just a great way to make friends and build collaborations in general. Like some of my best friends now that I have in psychology are from CISP. So here's the email, for example, that I sent Jay after CISP asking about a postdoc. It's quite long. This is the important bit. Just touching base, seeing like if he has funding, if he's still wanting to take on a new postdoc, just kind of reminding him that we had discussed this and had both expressed interest in working together. And, you know, this did ultimately end up being successful. So yeah, personally big fan in using the technique of just meeting people and making friends. And like, if you end up having similar interests and feel like a collaboration would be fruitful, like it is a mutually beneficial situation to end up in a postdoc together. It's not like weird for you to be asking that. Miscellaneous tips, you don't just have to stick to your own specialty. So I feel like when we're thinking about getting postdocs, it's very tempting to only think about looking in psychology or looking in our own discipline. But like these are just some of the other disciplines that do work that has overlap with postdocs, and you might be missing out on a really great opportunity if you're not looking in, say, like political science and seeing what they have. If you do stuff that's like kind of intergroupy or has a political flavor to it, it could end up being that the perfect collaboration for you is not in psychology. Also taking a global approach. So if you're really bound by region or location or country, obviously that reduces the number of options you have. So to the degree that you are able to be open about location and even think internationally, you are improving your chances. Also, like as Diego mentioned, this can mean like if you're doing the networking approach, that you're finding funding with your advisor as opposed to like working off their existing grant. In only one of the potential postdoc opportunities that I was exploring did the person have an existing grant that I would have been working on. All of the others, it was like, oh, well, let's apply for funding together. So these are some of the funding mechanisms that you could think about using. So for example, I'm partly funded off the Center for the Science of Moral Understanding. I've applied for the NSF postdoctoral fellowship. Yeah, and Russell Sage Foundation. There are just a lot of different avenues depending on what your research interest is through which you can try and find funding. And like maybe you have one funding source, like maybe you're fully funded through the NSF, or maybe you're cobbling together a stipend between things like the Center for the Science of Moral Understanding and Templeton and RSF. In general, my advice is to apply early and often. Obviously, it's a lot of work to submit a bunch of grants, but it's good practice for the future. If you do continue in academia, and even if you go into industry, a lot of the time, a lot of your job will be submitting grants. So this is good practice. And the more you apply to, the more you will get rejected. So, you know, there will be some no's, but hopefully there will be at least one or more yeses among all of those. So yeah, that's all I had to say, and I'm happy to answer questions about my experience after Kim is done talking as well. So I will just hand that over to her now.
Thank you, Victoria. That was great, especially the use of the actual emails that you sent to people, just to make it really concrete about the ways that you can approach somebody. And the informal ways these happen, you know, at conferences and summer schools and stuff is really nice. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I've very much would overthink the emails before I sent them. So it seemed important to show like it's not that deep. They can be quite casual.
Yeah, totally. Okay, we'll pass it on to Kim.
All right, perfect. Thanks so much for your talk, Victoria. So today I will be presenting a little bit of tips and tricks that I kind of picked up across my journeys to both of my postdocs. So I've already done, well, I'm currently in the midst of doing my second one. And today I will kind of broadly or quickly talk about some advice that you can use in order to decide whether or not you actually want to stay in academia, whether or not doing a postdoc would be something that would actually be a good fit for you. Then talking really quickly about my academic journey so far, and particularly the two routes that I took to get to postdocing. Although given the time, I might go through those a little bit quickly. So really quickly, by a show of Zoom emojis, and by the way, if you do not feel comfortable to disclose, then please don't vote. But if you feel that you definitely know already that you want to continue in academia, go ahead and give a clap. If you know that you probably at least want to go to the next steps, let's say you're a master's student, you probably want to do a PhD probably wants to do a postdoc, give a thumbs up. If you have no idea, throw out a heart. If you think that you probably want to leave, the crying smiley face, and then the celebration if you know that you definitely want to leave academia and go for something like that industry life. So I'm getting a variety of responses so far. And this seems to be relatively quite consistent with a lot. So I'm getting a lot of claps, thumbs up, hearts, laughing smiley faces, basically the entire board. And so far throughout my academic journey, a lot of the people that I've kind of grown up with inside of academia, I find that we tend to rotate very often between these three steps, if not the entire spectrum. And sometimes this is even on a day-to-day basis. So you wake up in the morning and you're like, man, I'm killing it. I definitely want to continue in academia. Then by the end of the day, you've gotten 3 grant rejections and a paper rejected. And then you're like, nope, that's it. I'm out. I definitely want to leave academia. So if you know where you are on the scale and you tend to rotate back and forth a little bit, just know that this is something that is indeed normal and that a lot of other people tend to go through this as well. So how do you actually decide? How do you decide that you actually want to do a postdoc, that you want to go to the next level, that you want to continue in academia? Unfortunately, there is relatively no easy answer, and I'm sorry about that. Normally, when I have these kind of questions, the first thing that I do is I go and I look for advice on Google. And here I went and I Googled specifically, how do I know if I want to do a postdoc, or information that you can use to figure out if you want to do a postdoc, or how to decide to stay in academia. And the results were relatively underwhelming. So a lot of the hits on Google were things like how to choose your postdoc position, saying things like choosing a successful postdoc position is probably one of the most, and I assume this is important things in your career. Or other information like what is the postdoc salary in the United States, which country is the best for a postdoc, how hard is it to get a postdoc, etc. All of this information is relatively important to know, but it doesn't really give you that information on how do you actually come to this decision. With the exception of this one, is it worth doing a postdoc? And when you actually click on it, it says 5 ways a postdoc will ruin your career by the cheeky scientist, which seems just slightly biased. So indeed, a lot of the information that is out there is almost all kind of like, it assumes that you know exactly what you want to do and where you want to go. And that is either, I definitely want to go and become a professor, I definitely want to go into industry, which is confusing considering that most people are not on the other end of that spectrum. So some miscellaneous advice that I can give to you that I have used throughout my career so far. The first one regards mentoring. Get a mentor, or 2 or 3 or 4, even if you want. Talk to people, get feedback about whether or not, about what academia is like for them, about their journeys, about what they did, how they did it, and why they did it. As well, make sure to understand like about work-life balance, if this is something that is really a good fit for you. In addition, I would also definitely suggest to be a mentor. And I know this kind of sounds a little bit self-serving, but what I didn't realize was that as I started to advance in my career and I started to get a lot of these mentoring relationships going on with a lot of my students, I realized that by actually mentoring other people, it helped me to kind of almost clarify what my own personal goals were and what my own ambitions were inside of academia. The next one is to write a career plan. Now, full disclosure, somebody suggested that I write a career plan at kind of the beginning of my academic career, and I thought that that was going to be a huge pain in the butt, and it was. And I didn't actually do it at the beginning, and I wish that I would have, because by the time that I was actually forced to do it for a grant, I realized how incredibly helpful it was. Now, if you don't know where you want to go, it's going to be a little bit more difficult to write a career plan, and this makes sense. So one thing that you can actually do is write one for academia and another one for industry. And then like that, you can actually compare and be like, oh, okay, well, here, this one seems really interesting because I can go and I can become a CEO or something, whatever. Or I can go and these are the steps that I might need to take in order to get to that professor position. And in order to inform about this career plan, a really good idea is to also look at a lot of job advertisements. So this includes looking at advertisements, not for the position that you would get now, but for the position that you, different types of positions that you want to get in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, whatever. And you can go and you can actually look at the different requirements that are listed on those advertisements and think to yourself, okay, well, maybe if I start to work towards these specific goals now, then it will be a larger payoff in the future. And like this, you would actually be able to tailor your career plan to the position of your dreams or the position that you are starting to think about now that you would be looking forward to in the future. So for example, if you want to become a professor in Switzerland, you could go onto the Swiss Science National Foundation website, and you can actually look at the requirements that they have in terms of the research output list and the CV requirements for those professor positions. So you can say, okay, this is my CV now, here are where the holes are, how can I fill in these holes? And you can actually work towards it. Same thing if you want to go into industry. If you find a specific career trajectory inside of industry that you're really interested in, you can start to target it and you can try to hit off at least some of those goals. Some more information or some more suggestions that I have are to get informed, because indeed we know academia is definitely not perfect. It is highly, highly competitive. And thus you need to have a relatively high level of resilience, right? We get rejection letters all the time. We get rejections for papers, we get rejections for grants, we get a lot of criticisms of our work, et cetera, et cetera. So if you don't have a high level of resilience already, it's going to be, you're kind of like a little bit of a disadvantage in terms of how happy you're going to be pursuing one of these careers. Also, please keep in mind that the number of PhDs that graduate and then go on to become professors is very, very low. I cannot find a reliable source of this information. All of the data sets that seem to be published are relatively quite old, like from the 90s or something. But guesses seem to be somewhere between 0.45 to 3% of people make it from the PhD position all the way to professorship. So this is something that you can also keep in mind when you were thinking about whether or not you want to pursue a career in academia. Not to say that if you do a postdoc, you definitely want to become a professor, but just something that you can kind of think about. As well, job security is a bit of a joke. I know so many people, fortunately, I never had to go through this, but so many people I know were on 1 month, 3 month, 1 year contracts. And especially if you have a family, or if you, I don't know, would like to build a life somewhere, this can be incredibly stressful. You have 3 or 6 months to be able to prove yourself, to be able to get that paper out. And at the end, I also know a lot of people that ended up working on chômage or working on unemployment while they were actually filling in those grants and while they were actually finishing those papers. And thus it is not surprising the amount of anxiety and depression that we have, which is kind of rampant inside of academia right now. So this is from the 2019 PhD survey and showed that up to around 36% of respondents sought help for anxiety or depression caused by PhD studies. Now, if they had also polled within 1 to 2 years after graduating from the PhD, I bet you this number would be significantly higher, because in my cohort, almost everybody that I know sought help for anxiety and depression within plus or minus 1 year of graduating. So this is something that is a problem in the field and that we know is a problem in the field. And ideally, some people are starting to address it. But one kind of aside, please, please, if you are one of the people that say, I just need to work 1,000 hours a week right now in order to finish my degree, be that the master level, the PhD level, whatever, and then in the future it will be better, please talk to your advisors and talk to your mentors about how you can better manage your stress and expectations, because you are on the road to burnout. Anyway, that was a small aside, but in line with getting informed, I would be remiss if I did not talk at least a little bit about equality. So this is from the University of Geneva. Sorry, it is in French. But if we look at the number of students at the bachelor and the master level, we can see that more than half of them are female. But then by the time they go up to professor, you can see that more than 70% of tenured professors at the University of Geneva are male. And this is not, the University of Geneva is by no means an outlier. So I went onto the NYU website and I tried to find another kind of beautiful image like this. And this is what I saw. 55% of the faculty at New York City campuses are men. 55% are men, 45% women. It seems like it's relatively equally distributed. However, I went and I started digging into the data and I actually calculated this, and only 33% of tenured professors at NYU, particularly at this campus, in 2019 were female. So gender equality inside of academia is not great. Racial equality is even worse. There are so many other types of equality that I'm not going to talk about right now just because it's going to make me angry. So I'm going to skip it. But these are just kind of some things to keep in mind when you're thinking about whether or not academia is for you. However, things are indeed changing. Change is inevitable, right? So equality is definitely on the radar. Compared to when I started my studies versus now, you see that equality is being pushed for and people are realizing that this is a huge problem. Publish or perish mentality is decreasing and instead it's switching over to quality over quantity. There are more non-professor permanent kind of academic positions that are opening up. They are still relatively rare and they are highly competitive, but there are more of them. And there are more scientific or what I call science adjacent positions that are starting to open up in industry. This is why if you are on an academic trajectory right now, this is why going and looking at some of these job advertisements right now in particular is really encouraging, in fact, because there are more of these positions that are opening. So now comes the second half of my talk, which is where I'm talking about my academic journey and how I got to my specific postdocs. And this part I'm going to go through relatively quickly because there's not a lot of time left. And both Diego and Victoria touched on these. So I'm going to focus particularly over here. So postdoc 1, I essentially was writing my PhD and I got a job advertisement to work in the lab with Professor Tobias Brosch. And I thought, okay, this is the job advertisement for me. It looks really interesting. I actually kind of had my eye on this lab a little bit before. So I went and then I applied. I took a weekend off of writing my PhD thesis in order to create my application for this position. And I ended up after a 4.5-hour interview going through and getting that position. Then towards the end of my funding here, I was like, well, I really want to study intergroup dynamics. So Tobias, who used to work with Jay here at NYU, was like, okay, you have to go to New York. You have to work with Jay. Jay is amazing, and definitely sang his praises. So I decided to write a grant. Tobias put me in contact with Jay, and we wrote a grant together. Jay also gave me a couple of suggestions about other grants that I could also apply for. So these are the two different journeys that I took in order to get to postdocing. So the first one I'm going to call job search, and it's in quotes because I didn't really search all that hard. It was something that was kind of sent to me. But the benefits of taking this approach are it's really great if you want to stay in academia, but you're unsure what you want to do and or what you want to study. Or it's also really good for those taking the plankton approach. And by the plankton approach, I mean, those are the people that are kind of like going with the flow, right? You finish your master's degree and you're like, I don't really want to know what I want to do. I don't really know where I want to go. This PhD seems interesting. I think I'm going to take that. Or you finish your PhD and you're like, I don't really know what I want to do. I don't know where I want to go when I grow up. Maybe I should do a postdoc in environmental psychology. Just random example. Another benefit is that you don't usually need to apply for grants in this case, because usually the people that are putting out the job search or the job calls already have funding for you. However, the cons of this is that you also usually don't need to apply for grants. So if you finish your first postdoc and you have your CV and there is a hole where it says, have you applied for any grants? And you say no, then that is kind of a little bit of a mark that's going to count against you. As well, it's potentially less optimal if you have the more direct route in mind. So this is the opposite of the plankton approach, where you know exactly where you want to go and how you want to get there. And some miscellaneous advice that I can give to you is definitely, if you want to take this approach, is to get on all of the mailing lists. Get exposed to as many job advertisements as you can, because then you will have a more representative list to look from. The second route to postdocing is to find your own funding. And this one is a little bit more advanced. So this is what I call the direct approach or the Dexter approach. So here you often get to work with your dream team, your dream advisor, your dream lab, and study exactly what you want to study. So if you already know where you want to go, then this one might be a little bit better for you. And here you often have more flexibility. So very often, if you show up in a lab and you have your own funding, then maybe your advisor might be more open to you working remotely, for example, from Switzerland. Or there might be more flexibility in terms of what you want to be able to study, because you're not tied to that professor's grant. You kind of get to do a little bit of your own thing in collaboration with them. Also, as I mentioned, grants look really great on your CV. The cons, however, is that you also have to write a grant. Grant writing is tough, but as Victoria also mentioned, it is really good to get a lot of exposure to grant writing because it is a little bit of an art form. And one other con that is not really very often talked about in this part is that it kind of gives you a little bit narrow field of view. You get a little bit of tunnel vision. I know exactly what I want to do and how to get there. So the path to get there seems relatively quite straightforward. But at the same time, you're also limiting the amount of other options that you can take, right? If you know exactly this is what I want to study, this is where I want to study it, and there's only one professor position that's going to open in that department, over the next 5 years. And if you don't get that position, yeah, then you're going to have to do a little bit of shuffling, and it's might be less optimal. But again, this also definitely depends on the circumstances. My advice to you is to apply for all of the grants. So like I said, Jay gave me a couple of grants that he suggested I apply for. One of them I was eligible for, but because my first choice grant, which was from the Swiss National Science Foundation, went through, I decided to come here on that grant. Also, I don't think I got the other grant, but anyway. Here, I also recommend definitely doing research. So Diego already talked a lot about this, about how you can find a lot of information about how to select the right postdoc, and how a lot of the advice for doing a PhD is going to be applicable in this situation as well. And just as a little bit of a teaser, there are some really attractive funding opportunities also outside of the United States. So just as a suggestion, for example, in Switzerland, the starting postdoc salary is around $80,000 per year. So that might be a little bit of an incentive for you to go a little bit abroad as well. You get to go to Switzerland, and Switzerland is beautiful. So a little bit of wisdom that is passed down from my PhD advisor to all of you is do not take anyone's advice in these matters, including my own. What might be really good advice for one person is going to be really bad advice for another person. And like I said, you can also choose which advice to take and which ones will actually suit to you. So thank you very much. And I guess we can move on to the panel discussion.
Yep, thank you very much, Kim. These have all been great talks. I really love what you've put together. It really rounds out many of the ways of thinking about doing a postdoc and pros and cons and pathways. What I want to do now is turn to some of the questions that people have had. And so I'll ask Diego first if there was a question that you want to take from the question document.
Yeah, sure. I noticed that one of the questions someone asked, which is how and why did you all decide to do a postdoc? So I'll answer that for myself, which is a good question. I'm interested in academia and trying to, I guess, better my positions of landing an academic job. And I don't feel ready as a grad student to just start applying to academic jobs. The market's like really tough right now, and there are a lot of great people who are not getting jobs who are still on the market now, who are postdocs themselves. And so I think I felt like I needed a postdoc to help kind of build my research profile, to get a few more papers out, to just sort of be more competitive. And I also am not 100% committed when, Kim put up the emojis, right? Like I wasn't the clapping emoji of like 100% all in. I was sort of like, yeah, like I think that's where I'm headed, but I'm not 100% sure yet, because sort of depends on how the job market looks. And so I'm trying to keep also some of my options open. And I think that by doing a postdoc and building my research skills, that if things don't work out in academia, or if I discover as I grow into myself that actually what makes me most happy is research in a different domain, whether it's like in maybe nonprofit space or in industry or something, I think that still leaves those doors open to me, so I can do a postdoc and then still apply to like other jobs. So that's sort of how I viewed it. I was like, in a way, kicking down a life decision a little bit down the road, but also genuinely feeling like I needed a bit of time to build my academic profile, and I could use that opportunity to do that, and that it would still leave those doors open if I decided, you know what, this isn't actually for me. I don't want to be a professor or doing academic stuff, and I'd rather do something else. I think that those doors are hopefully still open. So that's how I decided to do a postdoc.
Yeah, Victoria, do you want to take the next question, or one of the questions that you
Sure.
wanted to answer?
Yeah, so I did show my email, so I'm guessing that question came from before. So I will answer best and worst part of a postdoc position. I would say that the best part is definitely like the ability to, at least if you are like seeking your own funding with the advisor and not just working off their grant, it's the ability to continue researching the questions that you're passionate about and that you're most interested in, and kind of having greater independence than you had in grad school in terms of like, I don't know, like structuring the projects and like having like more decision-making power, I guess, when it comes to like what the project will look like. So I definitely think like it's a big step up in terms of independence, but it still feels safe. Like you don't feel like, oh, well, what if I make some huge mistake and destroy this entire project. Well, because you won't, because you still have like an advisor who's there, who's helping you, who will tell you if you're about to do something incredibly stupid. I think that the worst part of the postdoc is probably the opportunity cost in terms of salary, because the salary, unless you're getting one of these like 100K plus postdocs in computer science or something that Jay mentioned, is a lot lower than like what you would get if you went straight into industry or straight to the tenure track. So you kind of are like sacrificing that, and you're also like taking the opportunity cost in terms of if you are going to continue in academia, obviously you aren't getting started on that tenure clock, you are delaying your start to that tenure clock. So you know, now you're expecting to get tenure in 10 years as opposed to like in 5 to 7 years. And but you know, on the flip side, there's also a plus to like a lot of the research that you did in grad school. Now there's time during your postdoc for some of that to come out and get published and be an in-press line on your CV by the time that you're going on the job market. So I really do think that like there are costs and benefits. For me, there were a lot more benefits than costs, and I didn't particularly want to just go straight to the tenure clock because I wasn't ready to have that level of stress yet again after having done like grad school and dissertation. I kind of wanted to like have a year where I'm not feeling like my head's on the chopping block and just like enjoy doing research. So yeah.
Thanks, Victoria. Kim, do you want to take the next question and share your thoughts?
Sure. So I'm also going to go for the best and worst parts about a postdoc position. I definitely agree with everything Victoria said. The best parts are that you start to build up your confidence, you start to get this independence, you start to get a better idea of like your own research and how that also relates to multiple other people. You get to have a better network, you get to work with a variety of really great people. You get to start, well, sometimes this even happens before, but by and large, you get to have more independence. The worst part about a postdoc position, however, I think is also, so if you're one of the people that is kind of kicking the decision down the road, so for example, do I continue in academia? Do I not continue in academia? Once you get, for example, to the end of your second postdoc, especially if your first postdoc was quite long, then kicking that can down the road becomes a little bit more stressful and a little bit more stressful. And you kind of realize, okay, well, it's time to make this decision and then either go for it or not. So yes, the best parts are the independence. The worst parts are as well, by the way, one thing I forgot to mention is that a lot of people have this idea that once you finish the PhD, things get a lot easier and things get a lot less stressful during the postdoc. This does not happen. I cannot stress this enough. Very often, a lot of the postdocs that I talk to, they say that they do even more work and they have even more stress than they did during their PhD studies. So this is probably something I should have put into my presentation, but this is also something to kind of think about. It can be a lot more stressful also having a postdoc position.
Okay, Diego, do you want to go to the next question? Or any other comments you want to make? We have about 8 minutes left.
Yeah, I mean, do folks have other questions that they didn't get a chance to throw in the doc that they are maybe that are on their mind now? I think Victoria and Kim covered a lot of great stuff, and it was great to see the example emails and to get on listservs. I totally echo that stuff of just creating relationships lots of different ways, and just trying to find out about different funding opportunities and kind of keep an eye out. But yeah, did folks have any other questions that they didn't get a chance to ask, or something that came up, or I don't know, anything like that?
Or more insider information that you want to know?
Yeah, under the hood info.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll add I can share a few of my thoughts on postdocs and getting them. So I think that postdocs in general are really useful, especially if you want like to be very selective about the type of academic job you get. And I want to say that my comments are assuming that the job market's going to return. So last year was like historically the worst academic job market I've ever seen in my life because of the pandemic. But hopefully universities are going to resume hiring and have to fill those positions. I know NYU is hoping to fulfill, we've applied to fulfill about 5 faculty positions next year. We have to get approved for funding. So there's going to be now hopefully a catching up because people have retired and left. and hopefully other universities have the resources to do that. So there is going to be hopefully a return, and if it does return to pre-existing levels, tenure track jobs are super competitive, but those are especially true at the most prestigious schools, which get a ton of applications. And the job placement record I've seen, at least in social psychology, is of people who start their PhD, about 5% end up at R1s where they have PhD students in social psych. But the reality is about 50% of people don't finish their PhD who start. And so of the people who finish, then you double that. And then that ignores the fact that the vast majority of university and colleges are not R1. So about 3,500 to 4,000 university and colleges in the US are not R1. So we're often talking about postdocs are really relevant, most relevant for that top kind of 100 research type of jobs where they want a really well-rounded research profile. If you want a teaching position, or you're interested in R2 or an R3 type of job, a postdoc might not be the best pathway to that. And all roads don't always go the same way. So I think the conversation about postdocs is really relevant to that kind of 100 R1 jobs where you want to be training your own PhD students. If you're interested in going to a teaching college or liberal arts college, a pathway might be like going and teaching for a year at a college like that. So that happened to one of my former students. She got a visiting assistant professorship at a liberal arts college. And then the next year she went on the market, she had like 8 interviews at liberal arts colleges because she had that teaching experience which she hadn't gotten during her PhD. So it's really also important for you to think that a postdoc is worth doing if that's your set of goals. If it's not your set of goals, there might be a better pathway for you and a more effective pathway. And then one other thing I'll say that several people alluded to is, and I think this is especially true under during the pandemic and the job market we've had, is thinking about building skills that open multiple doors. And so this is something we talk a lot about in our lab, obviously, is if you build like really good data science skills, analytics skills, statistical skills, communication skills, whether that's writing or presenting, those are skills that are in hot demand in industry and lots of different industries. And so it is also possible, and this has happened from students from NYU, where they've been in a postdoc, but they've gotten really good big data skills, and then they get approached at like a conference by Facebook and get lured into a job like that. And so there's lots of those opportunities too. And so I'm often a big fan of build as many skills as you can so that you're opening as many doors as possible. And so you can walk through as many of them that are as open for you. So once multiple doors open, then you can pick the direction you want to go in. So I would think of like using your postdoc also as a chance not only to publish things, build your network, build your independence, but also build your skills. And I don't just mean hard skills. I mean, take a writing workshop. A lot of our students and postdocs take like a professional writing workshop to write for the public. Turns out that's writing and clear communication is an amazing skill that applies to any job. So that's something else I also want to highly encourage as part of your PhD, but especially if you do go the postdoc route, is think about how to build the skills that make you competitive for as many possible jobs as you might be interested in. Yeah, I'll let maybe we could have a closing comment from each person. Diego, do you want to have about a minute closing comment and any other thought or idea that you wanted to share?
No, I think I would just reiterate what we said. I think that's a really good point about the variety of different paths, Jay, about that, a postdoc is well suited for pursuing more research. And if you want to do teaching, I agree. I've also seen a lot of visiting assistant professors, and then that seems to maybe like kind of morph into a teaching role at a liberal arts college. So I think probably for grad students or people wondering about postdocs, it's a lot of like, well, what do you want, right? Which is always the hard question when you're graduating from college or finishing your PhD. It's what do you want to do? And that's a hard question to answer. I know it's been, tough for me too. And trying to figure out, where do I want to go with this? Do I want the plankton approach? Like I love that little analogy, or do I want to kind of like aim for a specific target? I think that derives a lot of your decision making, but it's a hard question. And so I think the good news is that you can, even if it's a hard question, you can still try and like answer it by just having multiple conversations with your advisor about it, with your colleagues about it, and just like learning more about what those different roles and fields look like. I think the more you just like with any research idea that you're trying to work through these kind of life decisions, just the more you talk about it and think about it, the more progress you can make on sussing out what you like and don't like, or what you think you might want to do. And that'll drive, which do I want to do this postdoc, and what kind of postdoc and with who? and you can start to like try and take steps towards doing that, or aiming yourself in a different trajectory. Yeah, and just don't like put too much pressure on yourself. I always worry that these advice like threads or panels or whatever, it can sometimes feel intimidating because it feels all figured out and people are talking in hindsight of, here's this like journey and now I'm this amazing person who did, and it's like, that's so deceiving. You know, it's not, there are so many bumps along the way and there's so much luck involved with how things just sort of happen. So don't feel like intimidated or nervous if you're like, shoot, this can't, you know, this is just like overwhelming to think about. I think it's know that everyone experiences that, and that it's kind of like it's an easier thing said in hindsight than it is going through. And so everyone's in that same kind of collective boat.
Yep. Victoria, any last words or advice?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just echo what Kim and Diego said, and I do think that like for me, like doing a postdoc was the obvious right choice because I am interested in continuing in academia, and because I wanted to like at least for me, like move my research interests like in a slightly different direction than it had been like when I first started grad school. Like I used to do like a lot of empathy work, and I had shifted to doing more work on outrage, and I wanted to continue that and continue to build like that part of my research program before going on the job market. So I also think that like a postdoc can be a great option if you want to like uh learn different techniques. Like say you really want to like learn fMRI or something, like doing a postdoc in a lab that is familiar with that technique and that method can be great. Like it's just a good way to get more expertise in something that maybe you weren't able to get expertise in grad school. But there are also lots of other paths. Postdoc is just one of them, and a postdoc in psychology specifically is also just one of them. So it's good to talk to your advisor and think about your career goals and try and, you know, do informational interviews with people who are in a lot of different positions, whether that's a postdoc at a B school versus psychology, or like, you know, a visiting assistant professor, an adjunct, tenure track, R1 industry, just figuring out what's out there and like what might be a good fit for you and for the career, but also the lifestyle that you want to have.
Thanks, Victoria. Any last words, Kim? And then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, so I mean, what else is there to say? You guys have covered it. I guess essentially my main piece of advice would be is just talk to everybody and their mother. Like go through, get advice from everybody, but also remember that like just because you've gotten some advice that it may apply to you and it may not apply to you, and take it with a grain of salt, but get this feedback and make a smart decision about whether or not only do you want to continue in academia or industry or whatever sector, but where would you also be most happy? So just because you are the most amazing scientist in the world doesn't mean that you should feel obligated to continue in academia if it doesn't make you happy.
Okay, thanks. And that's kind of a really nice existential point to end on. You like zoomed out to the 10,000 feet. I love it. It's like very concrete, but we're gonna continually go big picture. It's like, it's an existential question whether you should do postdoc or not. Okay, so thank you so much to all our panelists and other lab members for sharing their questions. And we'll look forward to doing more of these types of panel discussions. I really enjoyed all of it. I thought it was super useful and nuanced and thoughtful. So thank you all for taking the time to do it. Okay, bye.